So, Erik, can you talk a little bit about the origins of the mobile advisory teams, and what triggered the brass to institute a program like that when they did?
So the Americans in South Vietnam had been involved in training the South Vietnamese from a very early age, from really the time that 55 or so, the first American advisors went in there. But for a long time, the focus was on the regular South Vietnamese armed forces. And that was true until about 1968. And what changes, because the MAT program was started in March of 68. A couple things led to its creation. First off, you had now a very robust, fleshed out MACV advisory program for all the South Vietnamese units. So they were pretty well covered, right? So we had some extra bandwidth. The second thing is, this is, of course, coming right on the heels of the 1968 Tet Offensive. And one of the things Tet had done is to really underscore the fact that the South Vietnamese territorial soldiers, the ones who did security in the countryside, were really not well trained, not well equipped. And when Tet happened, the government lost control huge parts of the countryside, at least temporarily. So the recognition was, okay, we really got to bear down and help these other folks. And the third thing was, in this period, this is, of course, March 68, this is still well over a year before the United States made a decision to start pulling out. But there was always a recognition that, the U.S. won't be here forever. And if the South Vietnamese are ever going to basically, stand up mostly on their 2 feet and handle all aspects of the war, this was a very important one. So, time had come to help with these rural security forces. So that's why they created these teams. Generally speaking, it would be 2 officers, 2 junior officers, 3 enlisted men, and a South Vietnamese interpreter. So these are, small teams, 6-person teams. And the focus of these teams was on what they called the regional and popular forces. These were the South Vietnamese troops who, by and large, were responsible for security in the countryside. They would be, operating mostly as companies, platoons, or small units at the village and hamlet level. And so these were the folks who actually bore the brunt of the guerrilla war, and were chiefly responsible for maintaining security of the population. The South Vietnamese regular armed forces played a role there well, but they were more focused on the big NVA and VC units. So it's these local guys, these territorial soldiers, as they called them, that needed the help. So that's why they created these MAT teams to go out and live and work with these regional and popular forces soldiers, and to give them training on weapons, tactics. Unlike the MACV advisory teams that, like I said, had been around for a while, those MACV advisory teams were also larger. They were focused on the South Vietnamese regular units, and they also helped provide a lot of logistical support and liaison. These MAT teams being smaller and in the countryside, some of the challenges they had were that they didn't have necessarily sort of the same pull as the MACV teams. These small teams
Pull with whom?
like with the higher ups, like if they wanted something. So if you're a MACV advisory team and let's say you're stationed at a South Vietnamese division headquarters, you can get your opinion heard pretty quickly, right? Because you're at the headquarters. Yeah. But if you're these 6-person teams out in some rural village, right, in the countryside, you're not necessarily going to be able to, get in front of the division commander and say, hey, we need more razor wire, or we need more, construction material for sandbags, or this or that. So they face some real challenges because they were, I hate to say, sort of the redheaded stepchild in a lot of ways. The hand-me-downs. They had to scrounge to get some of the things that they needed.
Sort of a out of sight, out of mind.
Right, exactly. And it wasn't like, they were ignored. It's just that they did face those challenges. And another thing too is that for a long time, these territorial soldiers, these government soldiers, the nickname was Ruff Puff, RFPF, Ruff Puffs. Their reputation wasn't great, partly because they hadn't been well trained, they weren't well armed, often not well supported. But by 68, as they got more support, more training, and probably most importantly, they traded in their old World War II weapons for like M16s. So by 68, these Ruff Puffs, were approaching this sort of equipment and training of the South Vietnamese Armed Forces. So they were actually able to do a lot more. So again, when the MAT teams go in, they're not just a bunch of sad sacks. I mean, these are people who really want to, get the job done, and they start to have the equipment to do it. And so that is their focus, is to give these folks who operate on a local level, mostly security, some limited, patrolling, but more of a population security rather than big unit, go, through the jungle and look for trouble. These are the folks, the territorial soldiers, who are supposed to keep the VC out of the villages, guarding bridges, doing a lot of that, very important, although not very glamorous work.
Yeah.
And
what were some? I was just going to ask, what were some of the challenges or obstacles that might have made the work of the mobile advisory teams more difficult?
Well, in some respects, they shared some of the same challenges and frustrations as the MACV advisory teams, because South Vietnam was a sovereign country, right? These American advisors were advisors. They had no operational control. They can't tell their counterparts to do this or do that. They can suggest, and if the relationship is good, then that works out pretty well. But they have to be very careful too, not to overstep boundaries. And sometimes part of the frustration is that, say, this MAT team might have a very good relationship with, let's say, the regional forces company that they're working with, and the captain who, leads the company. Problem is that South Vietnamese captain may be working for a district chief who isn't quite so stellar, right? And maybe has some things going on that he's, more interested. Not all of them are correct, but, there was some of that. And so if you're a MAT advisor and you're working with your counterpart, and let's say you feel like you have a very good relationship, sometimes, they'll be like, hey, let's go patrol that canal. Because I think, the VC had been using it. And the captain he's talking to might go, oh, yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah, we'll do that. But first, let's do this other thing. And it's not because he didn't want to, but because he's actually being told by his district chief, no, don't go there. Don't go that area, because either
it could be any reason.
He doesn't want to take the casualties, or maybe even has a backroom deal that he's skimming off some of the money the VC are bringing, things like that, and not to mention, of course, the language difference,
sure,
the cultural barriers. I mean, these initial MAT advisors were basically pulled out of the regular forces, so they'd be infantry, artillery, or armor, and weren't necessarily given extensive training. I mean, some. Later on, they started going to classes at Fort Bragg, for example, and there was also a advisory school for the MATs at Xi'an near Saigon. So you could actually get more training, and would include things, rudimentary language training and a bunch of other stuff. But that only goes so far. obviously. And so there's always those challenges to navigate. That, even the best, the best well-intentioned, MAT advisor or MAT team is still going to find their environment a little bit opaque, right? They're not ever going to really understand. And by the time they kind of get a really good feel for it, if they're there 6 or 9 months, then sometimes, then they move to another area.
Right.
Or another MAT team comes in, they sort of start from zero.
Right. Because the M in MAT stands for mobile.
Mobile. Right.
Right. So they might.
In some cases, those mobile teams actually stuck put because there was so much work to be done. They didn't move around in life, but some of them did. Yeah.
So how did the role of MAT teams or the contribution or expectations of MAT teams change when we started talking about Vietnamization?
So again, with the MAT program got going in early '68, they formed about 353 of these teams. And eventually they, I think, reached a maximum number of like 487. Again, these are all across the country, and particularly in rural areas. But by the time, let's say, early '71, Vietnamization is underway. The U.S. combat forces are coming home. The drawdowns beginning. And so at a certain point, those MAT teams also have to be scaled back. So the MATs really 68, 69, and 70, those are their big years where they're just like going hell for leather to make a difference. Because if you couldn't get those Ruff Puffs up to speed, nothing else would work, right? That was a critical element. And they did a good job. They did make a difference. But by early '71, writing's on the wall. The U.S. is beginning to really draw down. And so what happens is the South Vietnamese themselves take over. So South Vietnamese regular forces by that point, had many, many years of training with the Americans and started their own MAT teams, which was the point all along. I mean, you want that. Yes. That would be preferable. I mean, the MAT teams are only a temporary measure. So, by the end of '71, the MAT teams are down to about 66. So '71, they go from the high point and then really start drawing down quickly as the South Vietnamese take over, which was always the point.
So if they're give me just a second. I want to try to form this well. You mentioned that advisors were on the ground as early as 55.
Right.
The MAT teams came later. It makes it sound like this was something very particular to the Vietnam War, but maybe not. Is there a historical precedent for American service members playing this kind of a role?
There were examples in previous wars where the American forces had taken on an advisory role, particularly during the Cold War, right? The early Cold War. You have these, what they call, military advisories and assistance groups all over the world. So you had them in the Philippines and Greece and, a bunch of places, Thailand. So this was something that was going on, really since the late '40s. But the difference about Vietnam is the scale of it. I mean, it dwarfed anything that we had tried before. So like I said, when the first advisors get to Vietnam in '55, and we're talking like less than 700, right? And so that scales up over, a while. And by '68, you have, thousands and thousands of advisors, maybe up to 10,000 all across the country. And the MATs, like I said, step in and start working with the Ruff Puffs. But you had these things called MALTs, which are mobile advisory logistics teams. which performed a similar function, but they would work with the South Vietnamese administrative units to help them sort out their supply issues and things like that. So there's so many variations, often at the unit level. American divisions and brigades usually had their own MAT type program. And they called them a bunch of things like impact teams and this and that and the other. But same idea. They would take a certain number of folks, create these mobile advisory teams, have them work with the local South Vietnamese forces. So you had actually many different layers of this type of effort going on, in addition to the official MAT program.
Did the members of these MAT teams come from all branches of service, or do they come?
Generally, I mean, you wanted combat arms. So like I said, I mean, infantry and armor, artillery, and something, unless they were logistics, advisors. I mean, you wanted folks who were familiar with combat, infantry weapons, calling in air support artillery, things like that. So you wanted folks who again that were able to handle them. And think of it too, these are 6-person teams, sometimes in pretty insecure areas, and so they had to really count on their South Vietnamese allies for their safety. I mean, there are sometimes where American units around, but let's say, like, for example, we're talking early 71 in the Mekong Delta, there were no U.S. combat troops there. And in a place like Kingang province, which is sort of towards the tip of the Mekong Delta, not that many Americans at all. So it wasn't like you could just pick up the phone, and have the cavalry show up 30 seconds later. You had to kind of really think this through. And again, like I said, you had to trust the South Vietnamese you're working with. If things got really hairy, of course, you get on the phone, call in air support, get a helicopter, because the Americans still had helicopter units, things like that. But they were in very exposed areas, and often living in a stare would be a kind word for it. I mean, again, like I said, often they had to scrounge for stuff, even just to get the things that they needed, not just the stuff they needed for the South Vietnamese, but their own stuff. The show MASH, right? And radar, he knows how to, wheel and deal. So there's a lot of that going on to make sure that you got what you needed.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, were the teams composed of people from the Army and the Marines, or was it always?
This was an Army effort. The MAT teams were Army. I mean,
it was Army.
The other service branches had training organizations. The Marines had a variety of programs, and one might even say their CAP program, combined action platoons. Although there's some similarities, living and working with the South Vietnamese in rural areas. So there's certain similarity there. Navy to a lesser extent, Air Force to a lesser extent. This is principally an Army. I mean, because the Army were just, they were the 800-pound gorilla.
Sure.
It's so much more people and resources.
Now I'm curious about the similarities and differences between Army MAT teams and Marine Corps CAP.
Right. Yeah, and it is interesting because the Marine Corps CAP program is one of those things that people love to talk about and argue about, and in short, the idea was, again, the Marines are up north in I Corps. the idea was to create these Marine platoons. So we're talking, 36 Marines, something like that, and then have them live and work with territorial, Ruff Puffs in villages and hamlets. And part of the idea was the Marines would help train those folks. So that's similar to the Mats. But the Marine Caps had a much more proactive role in actually patrolling and fighting. I mean, they would go out on patrols with the South Vietnamese forces. And so there was sort of a more locally an offensive oriented, approach. Another thing that was different with the CAP program, if you look at where the CAP teams were actually stationed, the vast majority of them were stationed in hamlets along Highway 1, right? Because if you know the topography, you know that the interior of I-Corps is mostly mountainous, and then you have this coastal plain, and Highway 1 is the main road, and that's where most of the people live. So a lot of these, these CAP teams were put in these hamlets. And again, not a VC hamlet. These were hamlets where there was nominal government control, right? But one of the functions of the CAP program that I feel, I'm not sure it's gotten a lot of attention, is it was really also an effort to keep their lines of communication open. Because if you have these CAP teams, in these hamlets along Highway 1, theoretically, you have a much better source of intelligence of potential threats. Because if you close Highway 1, you're in big trouble. You can fly a certain amount of, supplies, planes and helicopters, but most of the stuff went on truck on Highway 1. So I always thought that this was, to some extent, an effort by the Marines to kind of make sure that those supply lines, stayed open. Now, the CAP did some good things. A lot of the CAP Marines, highly idealistic, I think did a lot of good. Also did, medical care and economic care. But again, because they were small units, they had to get on the phone and call the local Marine battalion, which happened a lot because, 36, person Marine unit might not be able to handle a full VC company, right? So, so that was sort
if
of
they were
part
having
of
an off day, I could see
exactly, and that was the sort of the sort of discussion or debate of the value of caps. Did it make more sense to have all these cap platoons out there, given that when they got into trouble, then they, the other Marines would have to drop everything and go help them? There's a similar debate about, for example, MACV SOG and Rangers and things. So kind of every time you send a 12-person Ranger, team out there, you have to have all these helicopters waiting and, all this. I mean, there's all the support structure. So CAP program, like I say, was much, it was concentrated in this one area, and it had a slightly larger mission set. But yeah, the training and the living with the South Vietnamese, those things weren't common.
Thanks. That's useful for me.
Yeah.
How, bringing it back to the MAT teams, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important for listeners to understand?
I do think it's probably one of the less well-known aspects of the war. And I think if people heard of it, it'd probably be very easy to confuse them with the MACV advisory teams, right? Because the MACV advisory teams, again, were working with the South Vietnamese regular army. And whereas the MATs were working with the territorial soldiers and had some common mission elements, but the MAT teams are smaller, more remote, more challenging in a lot of ways. And so I think the thing that for me that I think is really important is that they came about, like I said, in early '68 as a result of several important things happening, right? Tet Offensive, you had a fully fledged out MACV advisory program, so you had some extra people to devote. The Americans were finally having enough spare weapons to give to the territorial soldiers. That's actually a big deal. We were scrounging the cupboard to find enough equipment. We were raiding depots in Europe to find enough M113s for the South Vietnamese. We had to ramp up the M16 production line. So for a while, there just weren't enough to go around. But by '68, the Ruff Puffs started getting M16s. Boy, that's a big advantage. It's a step up from the old M1, carbine. And so like I said, with those pieces in place, that's why '68 is when they started to really, build this thing out. And the third thing, like I said, is even though no one said it at the time, writing was on the wall. Even by early '68, Vietnamization was on the horizon, right? But again, not surprising, the United States never intended to be there forever. It was always going to be a withdrawal, just question of when and how and under what circumstances. But by that point, it was coming. It was coming. So let's get these territorial soldiers squared away before we go.
Got it. So let me ask you if you could just clarify one thing for me. You
Sure.
mentioned a couple of times that one of the factors was that the MACV advisory teams were sort of fully fleshed out, and so that created some extra bandwidth.
Right.
Can you help me understand that a little more?
So the MACV advisory teams were established at various echelons. So you had teams operating, let's say, with the South Vietnamese division headquarters, and teams operating with a province headquarters or a district headquarters or a South Vietnamese training facility. And the teams and their, the advisors would often get pushed down, at least to battalion level. So let's say if the South Vietnamese regular battalion is out in the field, there are American advisors with them, right? So it, again, it took a couple of years to kind of smooth out the wrinkles in the relationship and make sure that that MACV was providing the right kind of people, because again, you can't just grab any Joe out of the ranks and toss him in here. I mean, it does take a certain personality, a certain amount of training, a certain willingness. And so once they got that figured out and things were running pretty smoothly, that was always the first emphasis. Like, let's get the South Vietnamese armed forces up to speed, because if we don't do that, everything else is pointless. Once the South Vietnamese regular armed forces were starting to cook along pretty well, then, okay, let's turn our attention to these territorial soldiers who, have been often overlooked. And so that's what I mean. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. I promise this is the last question, but now
Sure,
I'm curious about something else, which is, and maybe this is a crazy question, so feel free to tell me if it is, but
crazy is even better. Sure.
But these soldiers that we're talking about, the ones who needed to be, quote, brought up to speed, unquote.
Yeah. These
are the same soldiers who drove out a colonial power like the French. I mean, what was it about the threat from the communist North that made us think, oh, we better give these guys some advice on how to fight?
Oh, yeah. And yeah, so this could sometimes be a sore point. Some of these South Vietnamese officers, these, Americans were advising, had been fighting since World War II.
Mm-hmm.
They'd been around the block a few times. And then you get this,
Plus, they know
22-year.
the terrain, they know the
Oh,
language, they know
yeah,
the
yeah,
tactics, right?
exactly.
How could we possibly advise them?
Right. And so that's an important point. So what advising actually was in most cases wasn't so much, oh, here's how you fight a battle, here's how you maneuver a unit. This is, what it really was is providing support. So those American advisors with a unit, they were able, very efficiently, for example, to call in artillery, to call in air support, to go back to, the Corps directorate and say, hey, we need more sandbags, or we need more rifles, or whatever, right? And so they, in many cases, are fulfilling that role, kind of a liaison role, not so much, hey, step aside, let me show you how. No, that is not. No, I mean, in some cases you would have, let's say, a South Vietnamese officer, who'd been promoted and was in charge of, let's say, a much bigger unit. Maybe, the step from like company to battalion is a pretty big one, right? And so even though they'd gone to school, maybe they needed a little help. I mean, who doesn't, right? And the South Vietnamese never could find enough qualified officers and NCOs. I mean, they're trying to train them quickly, but you had South Vietnamese infantry divisions. Normally, it'd be commanded by a 2-star, right? A major general. Some of them were commanded by a colonel. Because there weren't enough, qualified people. So in some cases, if that South Vietnamese officer was now taking on a new position with more responsibilities, he might go, hey, okay, so how do you do this and how do you do that? But in terms of actually fighting, no, that's that. The advisors were not there for that.
Okay. Yeah, that's important to clarify.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else before we?
No, I think it's, like I said, it's it's an interesting aspect of the war, and one that is still with us. The United States has always had a advisory element to it. We do now, helping, let's say, the Ukrainians, all the other folks that we're helping. Of course, look at Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq and Afghanistan was second only to Vietnam in sort of the scale of what we tried to do. And of course, they look back to Vietnam to try to learn some of those lessons. One of those lessons, of course, is that there's only so much you can do, right? It's sort of leading horse to water kind of thing. And there's so many factors going on with the folks you're trying to help. And most you don't even know. You don't even know what's going on, like what they're dealing with. So, of course, it can be challenging. But the fact is, the United States will always have an important part of its effort be devoted to, advisory efforts and training efforts with foreign nationals, with allies. And so this is one of the reasons I think we should, remember the MAT teams and other folks who did that in Vietnam. So if you look at the communist system of organization, military organization, that gives you some idea of sort of how to place the MAT teams and what they experience in context. So at the top, let's call this Major League Baseball, right? These were the big main force units, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, organized as regiments, divisions, corps, with all the artillery, and later on, of course, the tanks and all the toys. I mean, basically conventional force in every way, shape, and form. And then let's say AAA baseball, you have the province and district-based Viet Cong forces. So these would be usually battalion strength, sometimes company strength, that were again, almost exclusively recruited from the local South Vietnamese population. And they would be operating under the control of a province or district party committee, right? Those Major League Baseball folks, they're taking their orders from the big headquarters like Cosvin, right?
Yeah, from Command Central.
These AAA folks, it'd be a district or a province. And their mission, because they're controlled by these district and party committees, tended to be much more focused on things like attacking the Revolutionary Development Program, right? The hamlet, the government hamlets, maintaining logistics, getting information, things like that. Whereas the big boys, those are the ones who are going to invade your cities, fight the big battles, right? So at the bottom layer, say, single A baseball, those would be your guerrillas, right? And those are the folks who generally part-time, fighters, who are armed, but generally part-time, and they are based at the hamlet level, right? So we often confuse the words village and hamlet, or use them interchangeably. A village in Vietnam is an administrative unit, kind of like a county. So a hamlet is like a community, and a village might have 3 hamlets or 50 hamlets, right? So a hamlet is like the whatever, where people live, that of a one area.
Who are neighbors.
Neighbor, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it'd be at that hamlet level. So you might have, let's say, 10 guerrillas assigned to a particular hamlet, and they might be farmers by day, but they would have their SKS rifles, buried away. And when the folks above them, the party and district bosses, said, hey, we're going to be doing this thing, we would like you to, let's say, dig up a road, or take some pot shots at the American, or something like that, or give us intel, right? So you had these sort of 3 tiers. So the MAT teams were principally dealing with the guerrilla threat, and then the sort of the lower tier of the AAA fighters, sort of at the district, let's say the district level. These would be people who would just live and fight within, let's say, an area of like 5 or 10 or 20 miles, and almost would never leave that. And very focused on population, very focused on particular hamlets. And so, yeah, the MAT teams would be encountering guerrillas, and also this other set of folks called the VCI, the Viet Cong Infrastructure. These were these secret agents who actually lived in the villages and hamlets, who actually controlled the guerrillas, right? Who actually controlled the Viet Cong battalions and companies. So these VCI usually weren't armed, because they have secret identities. They don't want to be caught with weapons. But those are the folks, actually, they're running the shadow government. They're calling the shots. And so the MAT teams, one of their great challenges, of course, is if you're living in a working area in the hamlet, who's the VCI? Right? I mean, who's the guerrilla? Yeah, but sometimes the guerrillas pick up weapons and you actually see them, and you shoot. But these secret Viet Cong agents, in some cases, yeah, it may be the hamlet chief who's super nice to you, but in fact he's a secret. Again, so these MAT teams, they were not responsible for going after the secret Viet Cong agents. That was a whole different set of folks. And you've heard like the Phoenix program. No. So yeah, the Phoenix program was basically a intelligence program to figure out who these secret agents were.
I see.
Right. And that was South Vietnamese police and a bunch of other. So the Mats weren't doing that. That was not their job. But the fact is they're living in that world of guerrillas, of secret VC agents, of local force Viet Cong companies. And so that's what they're not seeing the big NVA regiments and stuff by and large. I mean, every once in a while if you're in the wrong place, but generally speaking, it's this guerrilla war.
Got it. Wow, man, I didn't have any idea that the Viet Cong were so so organized for one.
Oh,
thing.
that was
and also
that's their
so
special. That is their
multi-tiered.
superpower, is the party, the discipline of the party. I mean, they have everything organized to an insane degree.
See,
So
I just assumed that all of their orders at the highest level anyway were coming from Hanoi. I didn't think they were that they had such.
so in a way, so it goes like this. So Hanoi, so the Politburo, right, the ruling committee of the government, is basically like 10 or 11 people, right? Those folks make all the really important decisions. And they do this sort of in secret conference. And once they decide what they're going to do, then they publish what they call, resolutions or directives. And that's like, here's the plan. And then those resolutions then get sent down the command chain to headquarters in South Vietnam.
Hmm.
And those commanders then read those things, they discuss it, they talk about it, take notes, and then it gets sent down to the lower levels. So at some, point, yes, everything is being decided from Hanoi, but in terms of how it's implemented at the local level, that is up to those commanders. So the resolution says something like, okay, we're gonna fight a general offensive general uprising. We're gonna attack the cities at the same time we attack the countryside, and it's a lot of it's jargon, boilerplate, a lot of just yada yada yada. You really have to read through it to understand what's going on. But what it does is it provides a broad strategic blueprint.
Yeah.
It's down to those local commanders who then say, oh, so this is how I'm going to carry out my particular part of that grand mission.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, that's amazing. I think I discovered another thing in this conversation, which is the distinction, and it's an important one, between guerrilla style tactics and guerrillas.
Yes.
I had always equated the Viet Cong with guerrillas because of their tactics, but they were far from.
Oh yeah, I mean,
these were damn near professional soldiers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you go to the VC main force units, like again, we know Viet Cong is a pejorative term. They call themselves the People's Liberation Armed Forces, right? PLAF,
okay,
right? And the North Vietnamese, the People Army of Vietnam. So sometimes you hear PLAF and PAV. At any rate, a Viet Cong 9th Division is in every way a highly professional, well-armed, well-disciplined fighting force that can give most American divisions hell of a fight, excluding our advantages, in a sort of infantry fight, a hell of a fight. And they are organized in a lot of the similar ways that we are. But yeah, there's guerrilla tactics, which is sort of hit and run, right? But the guerrillas, which they actually have a name for them, they would call them, local self-defense force, something like that. Their principal mission was actually intelligence, and doing the heavy the heavy work, things like labor and digging trenches, or if someone in the hamlet was considered to be an informant, that guerrilla, those are the folks who would go whack them, take them out.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it was there's guerrilla tactics, but then there's sort of their status in this larger, very, very, and again, it's fascinating because one of the things that's very different from the American system is in the communist system, there's a parallel structure. There's the military and the political. So you look at a unit, right? And there's a military commander of that unit, but there's also a political officer. It's the political officer who makes the decisions, not the military commander. So the political officer says, we're going to do X, Y, and Z for these reasons. And then the military commander says, okay, here's how we execute. But the political officer is always the one in charge.
Amazing. And then would the political officer also wear a military uniform in every case?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And they would have a rank. I mean, like any of the other, officers. And again, we're talking about, the Vietnamese Communist Party. This sort of the iron backbone were the party members. So about 20% of all the soldiers in these communist units were actually communists, actually party members. Like they had been accepted, and they were, the 80% of them were not communists, technically speaking. A certain number of them might be aspirants. They would want to get into the party, but it was that cadre of 20% actual party members. Those are the folks who kept the discipline and the party's message.